In this video, we're going to be going over the equipment transfer settings and setup for admins. So let's go into an equipment record just to look at the equipment transfers area. This will be under the transfers tab on an equipment record. Here we can see how to enter a new equipment transfer just by clicking our entry here. And we can also see all of our historical transfers for this unit as well. Now, as we saw in another video when we demoed this functionality, here upon transfer completion, this will update our equipment details and also capture the new details on that equipment. So what do we really mean by that? So if I go into another equipment, let's do the CT2002. I go into our transfers here, and I can do entry, and this will set up a new equipment entry for me. And these old field values could be set blank. This is all set up in our dynamic entry screen. These field values are really going to capture the values at time of transfer completion. The old values will be captured. Now we can fill them out upon entry just for visibility purposes, or if the users only want to capture those at entry and not at point of completion. So say it's going to be, our new customer is Apple, and this is going to be at just legendary supply chain location. And I need my transfer date. Let's say it's going to happen tomorrow at 9:30. Now I can set up this equipment transfer. I can see that this is here. If I were to actually go into this equipment transfer, I can see that my old values are null, and these are my new values here. Now let's go ahead and complete this. And upon completion, it captured the old values, which were the values on the equipment at time of completion or time of closure. We can also see our transfer completion date time is filled out here. And we can see that, this was a transfer date. Here is our transfer completion date time, which is also the same as our closure date time, our close date time. Now, if I go into this unit, I can also see this has been updated to Apple, location has been updated to legendary supply chain, and we have updated our equipment transfer. If I click on my transfers record here, I can also have the option to enter them directly from this equipment transfer, which is really to start to put together in multiple transfers. So if I had multiple transfers from multiple locations, I knew I wanted to schedule them out in advance, and I knew that those source or old fields were going to be different, I could schedule them from the equipment transfer as opposed from the equipment directly. If you click on here, this is going to use your equipment as your parent record. It's going to default your fields from the equipment. If you do it from here, it's going to use the equipment transfer itself as your parent record and default your records from there. And what do we mean by that? Really, in our setup, in our legendary setup, we can go to our dynamic entry to show that form in order to enter a new equipment transfer. And so I can go in here and just search for equipment transfer under the dynamic entry setting of the legendary setup. And I can see we have our equipment transfer entry, which has the MP prefix in front of it for managed package. And from here, we can see that we have our single record entry, and we can also see our source record relationships, equipment being the primary one. And if we expand this, we can see our defaults here, which is going to be our equipment transfer entry, equipment to equipment transfer. And we can also click this icon here to edit these field mappings. This is particularly important if we add custom fields to the equipment transfer. We might need to go in here and set up those defaults upon entry. Generally, I do like to default the same field to the new and the old value, just because it makes entry a little faster when doing it from the equipment, because everything would default the same, and we could just override it for anything that would need to be changed. That is important because if the new value upon transfer completion is blank, it will null out that value. And again, these are from the equipment to the equipment transfer. Now here, this is the equipment transfer entry for the equipment transfer source for that situation where we're entering multiples in advance. Now here we do the new values as both the new and the old values, again, to kind of create the same effect upon entry, where we default those values and then we can override anything that may have been changed. And again, if we'd add any custom fields, we would want to add those here as well. We also have all of our standard entries up here in order to set these up, and so I have just a very basic setup where we have our defaults for the transfer itself. If we have other transfer information, such as a customer capturing mileage or anything like that, we might want to capture that in the transfer section. And then I have a new field values section for just the new field values, and another section for the old field values. Some accounts prefer to have this entry screen set up to where all of the old field values are on the left and all of the new field values are on the right, and you can modify these entries and these orders in order to set that up as well. So this is the primary entry for a new equipment transfer entry. This is associated to our search component down here for our equipment transfer. And this is just the equipment transfer screen, the search component that is on the equipment record page. And we could use the same search component to search all equipment transfers, or just to see those directly on the equipment record. And we can see we do have that icon here, which is the icon we use to enter a new equipment transfer directly from another equipment transfer. So this is the search components and the dynamic entry. Let's also look at the legendary settings. And this is really what's going to drive the automation that's going to fire whenever equipment transfer has been completed. This is under the equipment transfer settings right here. We can click edit, and it's going to show us a couple of things. One, we have all of our stage status relationships where the stage will drive the record status. This is very common for lots of records that have transactional staging in the legendary supply chain application. So the 4 record statuses are open, in progress, closed, and canceled. Open is the default. You can select the values that the stage matches our in progress record status, our stages that would be considered a closed record status, and our stages that would be a canceled record status. Anything that is closed will fire the equipment transfer field mapping automation, which is set up down here. If you do not want this automation to fire, you can simply remove these field mappings from this section, and nothing will fire upon completion of the equipment transfer or closure of the equipment transfer. And you just do that by clicking the X here. And if you want to add it back, in this case, this would need to be our equipment to equipment transfer. And so our transfer complete, equipment to equipment transfer, and then this is our equipment transfer to equipment. So whenever an equipment transfer has been moved to closed, the first automation that fires is the equipment to equipment transfer. This is where we map the current values on the equipment record to the old field values on the equipment transfer. So this is kind of a snapshot capturing a point in time as what those field values were on the equipment at time of transfer. So whenever we close that equipment transfer, we're going to take these field values that are on the equipment and capture those in the old values on the equipment transfer. After that has occurred in the automation, then we will take the fields that are mapped in the new field values on the equipment transfer and then map those to the actual equipment record. It is very important that all these field values are compatible field types, or hopefully are actually matching field types, meaning that if it's a lookup to a customer, it would need to be, or to an account, the new and old field values would also need to be lookups to that same object, which would be an account. Same thing for the physical address, text values, pick list values, date fields, date time fields, things like that. So just make sure that those are mapping correctly whenever we go to map these over. If you were to mismatch major field types, you do have a possibility for error. Generally, most things will map to a text field, but some things will not. So just in general, as a rule of thumb, make sure that those are matching to compatible field types whenever you do these field mappings. Another thing to note, these field mappings, because these are firing in an automation that would be initiated by a trigger, you cannot do constants, you can only do mappings, and you cannot go back multiple reference layers. You can only use values that are either on the equipment transfer or on the equipment in these settings for this automation. So if there is something additional you may want to capture by a lookup or something of that nature, you may need to create a formula field or some type of text value that you can reference on either the equipment transfer or on the equipment record itself if that was something you wanted to capture. And again, all of this is under the equipment transfer settings in the Legendary setup under Legendary settings. And then the entry is all under the equipment transfers entry under the dynamic entry section, and our search component is just our equipment transfers under the search component setup in Legendary setup. This is just a quick overview into the equipment transfer setup for admins.